team at the Institute. Our first guest here is Jeffrey Kaye. Jeff is a retired clinical psychologist. He's been researching and writing on U.S. war crimes for over 15 years and is the author of Cover Up at Guantanamo, the NCIS investigation into the suicides of Mohammed al-Hanashi and Abdul Rahman al-Amri. He currently writes for the blog Hidden Histories at Substacks, which is where I got to find your work. It's tremendous. So please do make sure to check out Comrade Kaye's Substack, Hidden Histories. I'll put that in the chat. But thank you so much for joining us, Jeff.
Great. Thanks, Carlos. I'm really happy to be here.
So I want to start by asking you, how did you get into this area of research, specifically the topic of biological weapons that I myself have trouble understanding why so many people who are within the anti-imperialist camp, who are critical of U.S. imperialism, why it's so often, it's so little spoken of when there's perhaps such an extensive history of using it. And even within folks that are sympathetic to our ideas and to anti-imperialism, it almost conjoins the discussion of biological weapons with like an air of conspiracy thinking. So how did you get into it? And then maybe we can expand into examples of biological warfare attacks and why it's brought that way by the media.
Right. Yeah, I had never been interested in biological warfare in my life, really. I'm a psychologist. I was working with torture victims at a torture treatment center in San Francisco in the early 2000s. I think I started literally in the year 2000. And, became very interested in the whole question of torture. And when you work with torture victims, you become kind of identified with them. And these were people from all over the world. It's just astounding the number of countries that practice torture. In any case, people are probably aware that sometime around 2004, late 2003, after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, details started to leak out about a special torture program run by the CIA, and then, of course, torture happening at Guantanamo. And it became very quickly reminded people of torture programs that the CIA had run in the past. And then there were investigations, et cetera, into this. And one of the things that I was a very interested consumer, really, at that point, reading about these stories and quite interested. And then kind of shocked to discover that American psychologists had been involved in the construction of these torture techniques. And in fact, historically, going back into the 1950s, had been involved with it. I was assured, though, by the New York Times and but also scholars and scholarly books that these techniques were supposedly adapted from techniques used by Chinese communists to elicit false confessions during the Korean War. So what false confessions? What are they talking about? They would say this as if I would know, but it didn't take long to discover that there was a scandal about false confessions in the Korean War about the American use of biological weapons or germ warfare or bacteriological warfare during the Korean War. And if you read almost any book about the Korean War, there'll be at least a few paragraphs, if not even a chapter, on this episode. And of course, what happened was that North Korea and China, and backed by the Soviet Union, accused in very early 1952 of a massive air campaign by the imperialist powers in Korea and also over northeast China, over Manchuria, of bombing attacks using germ bombs that were essentially filled with infected insects that would be dropped on troops or populated areas with an attempt to infect them with diseases such as bubonic plague, cholera, and anthrax, among others. And according to the North Koreans and the Chinese, these were techniques that had been picked up, if not brainstormed, out of the experiential base of the Japanese imperialists, who during World War II had an organization that people might have heard of called Unit 731 there were really a number of units, but the main one was called Unit 731, which had experimented, made vast experiments upon human populations, and then utilized campaigns of bombing Chinese cities with infected fleas, in particular, infected with the bubonic plague, and starting outbreaks of bubonic plague in China that we know today killed thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps, is my understanding. Well, this caused a huge, in the 1950s, this caused a mass, the left really was galvanized by this. They didn't hide from it. There were mass protests, Madison Square, not Madison Square Garden, but the equivalent of that in Toronto. I can't think of the name of it. Anyway, 10,000 people would come out to an auditorium to hear speakers talk about it. There were rallies. Nobel Prize winners started petitions against what the Americans were doing in Korea. And then, of course, there was a counter campaign by the Americans and their allies to claim that this was all a lie, a massive lie. And ultimately, these confessions had been, because what happened was a couple of dozen pilots made signed confessions that they weren't all pilots, some were navigators, but okay, airmen, U.S. airmen, which a few came from the Marines, the rest of them were the U.S. Air Force. Some of them were colonels. There were high-ranking officers accusing, and with a great deal of detail, that the U.S. was using these weapons. Anyway, the controversy raged for a few years, and it finally died down, particularly after the end of the Korean War, or rather the armistice of the Korean War, since that war really never truly ended. And anyway, supposedly the story, so the Americans did their best to wipe out the knowledge of their collaboration with the Japanese bacteriological warfare unit, which nobody knew about until a journalist by the name of John W. Powell exposed that link in the 1980s, literally 35 or more years after the end of the Korean War. That's how long, an entire generation of lies and cover-up over this, Japan's own use of biological warfare, not to mention the American use of Americans in the Korean War. That cover-up continues today. And it's sad to say, and Carlos, that much of the left collaborates in that just by maintaining their silence. And I think they're afraid of being burned. You know, this whole conspiracy theory thing. Well, what happened was a couple of Canadian, so how did I get interested in it? So I kept looking for it, and then I found the confessions, and they laid out quite reasonable and details about what this program was. And then I began to research farther on my own. I was coming towards the end of my career as a psychologist. I had to leave. I was having serious health problems for a while. And when I got over that and had retired, I took up an old love of mine, which was history. I'd been an undergraduate history major at Berkeley, and continued, so I had some understanding of how to pursue historical studies, and began to seek the documentation that would tell me once and for all whether or not biological warfare had really taken place or not. Because I began believing what I read in the newspapers and in the scholarly things, that this was coming from. Your listeners might remember the movie The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, with its diabolical racist views of Chinese scientists, brainwashing. That's where the term arose. It rose in the term brainwashing was what the CIA came up with as a term to use to brand anyone who believed in these biological warfare charges had been, quote, brainwashed by the diabolical Chinese communists. And so that's where all of that terminology came from. It didn't come from nowhere. It was all based in this historical scandal. And it's still a scandal, because what we now have is a scandal on top of a scandal. We have the original genocidal, really, because they wanted, biological weapons on this scale is a weapon of mass destruction. And they were, sending out hundreds of sorties, a month with these weapons, trying their darndest to start epidemics, or at least incapacitate large portions of the communist forces in Korea at that time. And we still don't know, by the way, how successful they were. They weren't vastly successful, that's for sure. In reading what I can about in the documentation that's available, is they weren't too happy with the results. The American imperialists were not too happy with the results. And internally, there were a lot of people who weren't happy with this crash program that the U.S. Army and the Air Force undertook to develop biological weapons during the Korean War, and because it distorted the normal scientific mode of developing new weaponry. And what I believe they're referring to, although they never say it outright, is it was their decision to utilize the Japanese biological warfare experts from World War II, who the U.S. had had rescued from war crimes trials, and made an amnesty with them, and made an agreement that if the Japanese would turn over all their documentation about how to make germ weapons, then they wouldn't prosecute them for war crimes. So that was a shock to me too. I mean, this has just been one shock after another, because the levels of when the CIA or the American State Department or the Pentagon want to cover up something, they don't just do it with one lie. They do it with layers and layers of lies, part lies, obfuscation, and that's what I've been trying to uncover. And what I did come across finally now it's been like 7 or 8 years ago, was declassification of certain files by the CIA of their own communications intelligence reports from the Korean War. And these reports detailed numerous instances of overhearing North Korean or Chinese People's Volunteer Army communications that were encrypted and then decrypted, of course, by cryptanalysts working for the predecessor of the NSA, and then turning those documents over to the CIA for intelligence purposes to analyze them. And these documents were transcripts of communications within the North Korean and Chinese military discussing the problems that they were having while being attacked by biological weapons. So this was, to me, was a smoking gun. In other words, a smoking gun is, from those who like mystery stories as I do, is you're always looking at circumstantial evidence, or you want to find the evidence of the crime. There's nothing like literally someone standing there with a smoking gun in their hand and the bullet just came out of it. Well, that's what this was like. It's like, for decades they'd said there's no proof of the use of biological weapons. This was all, at best, fanciful theories off of partial facts, such as the partially admitted fact that the U.S. did have a biological warfare program to develop biological weapons during that period of time. But of course, they were never used. Just believe us. And meanwhile, the other thing that blew my mind, by the way, for your listeners, was so how did this all get covered up? Well, one of the major ways it was covered up, and you mentioned being demonetized at YouTube. Well, of course, we're living through now a situation of censorship, really, which you want to keep the information. Censorship is about keeping information away from people. And you do that by scaring them. You do that by canceling them. You do that by demonetizing, making it impossible practically for them to operate. You do that by slandering them. I mean, there's a number of different ways you can do this. So one of the things they did was, during World War II, there was a not too controversial, because the war was somewhat popular against the fascists anyway, and there was an issue about the Nazis sending, propaganda into the United States, to better their cause. So the U.S. government under Roosevelt used a law from 1938 called the Foreign Agents Registration Act, or FARA, which people read about still today. It's still misused, and still it's saying that you can label someone a foreign agent, right? And then you can prosecute them or fine them unless they've admitted they're a foreign agent. Of course, what foreign agent? If you're a secret foreign agent, you're not going to admit to the U.S. government that you're a foreign agent. So, given that, if the government comes and says, yeah, you, Jeff Kaye, you're a foreign agent, well, that's, already, people are going to stop wanting to listen to me. And but to make matters worse, what they did though with this is they used and said anybody in a foreign country who was sending literature that they thought was either secret or derogatory to the United States forces in a wartime setting were foreign agents. And as a result, you could keep that mail. This is, of course, before the internet. And many of your listeners might go, well, what do you mean before the internet? Before the internet, unless you went to your library and got a book, or you listened to a radio show and heard it on the radio or television, or you could somehow get it in a bookstore or a magazine rack, you didn't know what was going on in the world. And what they did is they said, we're just going to ban all magazines and newspapers and journals and textbooks and recordings from coming from any communist country. And we're not going to do it by making a law about it, because that might have caused problems in a country that at least fetishizes the idea that we have freedom of speech, and there's still fights over that every single day. So instead, what they did is it's just like when somebody bans you at Twitter or YouTube takes away your monetary platform. They don't have to tell you why; they just do it. And so they said, well, we're not going to allow any mail to come in from China or the Soviet Union or Cuba or China, or North Korea or Eastern Europe or any so-called Iron Curtain country. And that was how they kept information out. And that meant that if the Chinese published, as they did, a magazine with all the confessions, and later in book form, all the confessions of the American flyers to biological warfare, they never made it to the country. They were burned. They were destroyed, along with all sorts of others. There were hearings about this. Not everyone was happy with this, of course. In fact, among those who weren't happy were American scientists, because they couldn't get scientific journals from the Soviet Union, and they knew that the Soviets were very sophisticated scientifically. So that when Sputnik, the satellite, came out and shocked everybody in America, that the Soviet Union could have such a thing. Well, anyone who was reading Soviet scientific journals, which they could have been reading, wouldn't have been shocked at all. This wasn't some super top secret project. In fact, the Americans had done it to themselves. They had cut off contact. So the editor, or rather the publisher of the journal Science, which is one of the major scientific journals in the United States, did editorial after editorial saying, we have to stop this crazy program of banning everything from, Iron Curtain countries. We're not getting the information we need. The only reason I found out about this was because an American scientist who I was had written to with some questions about the biological warfare issue wrote back to me and said, well, Jeff, by the way, he just said it as an aside, by the way, as you know, our archives just aren't very good because, they didn't allow, things were censored out of them for a couple of decades. Now, to myself, I'm reading, first time I read that, I went, oh, okay. And I just kind of moved on. I couldn't even take in what he said. Only literally a couple of years later, rereading his email for another purpose, I looked at what he wrote and it just sunk in. I said, well, I've got to look this up. I've never heard of this. I said, there must be an essay, an article about this. Yeah, the only article I could find was written in 1959 in the Pennsylvania Law Review, who was protesting against this program, which finally, by the way, ended by Supreme Court order in 1965. But it began when? In 1950, the year the Korean War started. And there were congressional hearings about this because some of the government wanted to codify this into law, and they had trouble doing it. They never were able to actually codify it into law. Well, they were, excuse me. Sorry about that. Codify it into law in the early 60s because the Kennedy administration had just wanted to cancel the program. So the kind of conservative Congress did finally pass a law, but in doing so, they found out why they never wanted to pass a law. It meant that you could then challenge that law, and the ACLU did challenge the law, and it worked its way up through the courts to the Supreme Court, who found the law to be, of course, unconstitutional. And since then, that's when Mao's little red books started to flood into this country, by the way, and other communist literature from China or East Europe or Soviet Union. But before that, it was very difficult to obtain. That's how backward and how much we were like in Plato's cave, if you will, by not even knowing what was there. And that's how it's been for me through this whole time. It's been one revelation after another, and I'm still gathering new information. It's kind of terra incognita for someone like me. I'm out there exploring a world that was covered up, literally, around the time I was born, so 70 years ago. A whole world of information that was covered up 70 years ago is suddenly opening up, and just one new revelation after another. It's kind of shocking. So why doesn't the left do this? Because ultimately the left, I think, ended up buying they were uncertain. It was buying the imperialist lies that, well, they didn't know where's the evidence? It wasn't there. And when some evidence finally supposedly leaked out in 1998 in the form of so-called letters rescued from old Soviet archives, they were blatant forgeries that couldn't withstand even a cursory textual analysis. But of course, since these were put out by imperialist agencies and rubber stamped by the U.S. press, and there was no one to say boo otherwise, people just let it go, and no one knew what to do. So I'm hoping I'm doing a service by giving people the tools to take up something that I believe people will continue to study for many, many years, including after I've passed on, because there's that much there to look at.
Wow. This is amazing stuff, man. As I'm sure you experience as you discover and write about it, so much of it is so completely underexplored and hidden. You had mentioned the comment documents. You described them as a smoking gun. How do those fare in comparison to the evidence that was coming out from the communist countries that was hidden or censored by the U.S. state? And in the instances where it wasn't censored, it was just completely dismissed as communist propaganda. Comment documents, did it confirm the accusations that the communist states were making?
Absolutely, yes. They did in both in terms of the timeline, which was important. The comment documents begin with claims of being bombarded by biological weapons. When I say comment, that means short for communications intelligence. It's just a term used in the spook community, shall we say? But it's an acronym, and I can't just keep saying communications intelligence all the time. So these comment documents match the timeline of the accusations of people like the foreign minister of North Korea, or the foreign affairs minister of China, who in February of early March of 1952 had outlined the various attacks that were taking place upon them. We don't have by the way, all the comment documents, and we know that there's got to be more just by the textual analysis of those documents themselves, which speak to other documents which have not yet been released by the U.S. government. I found these documents partly by accident. Well, I wouldn't say it was accident. The CIA has a Freedom of Information Act website, which is often down, by the way. And one day I was looking at it, and I just would type in Korean War biological weapons just to see what was there. I'd done it numerous times, but this time what popped up for me was a whole group of documents which the CIA themselves had labeled baptism by fire. And what had happened was, in the year 2010, on the 60th anniversary of the outbreak of the Korean War, at least the official outbreak of the Korean War, in the West, the CIA, in conjunction with the Truman Museum, had released hundreds of previously classified documents, about the Korean War, and they called this release "Baptism by Fire." And they had a CD that they sold even for a little while, and they had a colorful booklet that they talked about. Because the controversy for them that they were looking at was, how was it, as the U.S. government types and the mainstream historians, how was it that the U.S. was so, and South Korean government were so surprised by the North Korean attack? How did this surprise attack take place? How was it that they pushed back and the North Koreans overran the American forces and the South Korean forces in June and July of 1952, and pushed them back to a little corner in South Korea, which might have been the end of it if there hadn't been a massive pincer attack by MacArthur at Incheon in September of 1952. And people who know the history of the Korean War, and probably very few do, because it's not taught in the schools, you'd have to pursue it on your own. But for approximately 6 to 9 months, there was quite a seesaw in the Korean War. The North Koreans swept down and almost destroyed the South Korean government, and the U.S. forces were not too major there. They had been withdrawing for a while, and pushed them into the corner of Busan down in the in the southwest corner of the country. Then there was the attack, the counterattack by the Americans, and then the North Koreans were overextended. They fell back, and the Americans pursued with a massive invasion all the way up to the border, pretty much with China. At that point, in October, November 1952, China entered the war and swept back and gave the Americans the biggest defeat they had ever suffered in an international war setting, and pushed the Americans way back down below the 38th parallel again. Both Pyongyang and Seoul were occupied and then reoccupied and then occupied and then reoccupied more than once by both sides. So things really went back and forth. The Americans weren't doing too well. And that was one reason, by the way, that they began to talk about using nuclear weapons, nuclear bomb on North Korea. And but they were afraid. They were afraid because of the Soviet, how they might respond, and they weren't. There was a lot of, some people wanted to do it, some people didn't want to do it. They were afraid of China to a certain extent. Others wanted to destroy the new Chinese Communist government. Remember, in China, the Chinese Revolution and the coming to power of the Communist Party in China had only just happened in 1949. So here we are in 1950, barely a year later, and another major war breaks out. And this was the Chinese considered it very carefully, and they felt that further, existentially, they needed to enter that war for their own safety, but also out of solidarity with the North Korean government. And they entered the war, and so the American imperialists decided not to use nuclear weapons. And they decided that they would turn to, they listened to certain people within their own military, and who believed that biological weapons could do the trick. The problem was the U.S. biological warfare weaponry that they had, the kinds that they wanted to like any weapon systems, carefully, work it out on the drawing board, test it, retest it, field test it, before you standardize it and go. To put a whole new weapon system into play, if anyone follows that kind of thing just in the newspapers, it takes a number of years. So you just can't do that in a year or two. So they had all these Japanese experts sitting over here that had been working with MacArthur's people in Japan in their healthcare system, and they were more than ready and happy to use biological weapons and their expertise to help the Americans against the communists, as they saw it. And that's what happened, I believe. I mean, again, none of these comment documents, by the way, say, oh yeah, that reference Japan at all, at least the ones that I've been able to see, the ones that so far have been released. And none of the, with one exception, I remember, and it's a very tiny remark, did the flyers, the Air Force and Marine Corps flyers that the China captured and who signed confessions of use of biological weapons mention Japanese bacteriologists or bacterial experts at all? So if this had been, in fact, a hoax set up by China or North Korea or the Soviet Union, the way that American scholars claim, then why would it be that they would not, in their hoax material, set up confessions that touched on U.S. collaboration with the Japanese imperialist Unit 731 people? Well, that's because it wasn't a hoax. And sure enough, the American flyers, they didn't know anything about the background of who had organized the entire biological warfare campaign and how, the history of it. They didn't know. They know what they were told to do. So, but people who did know would include historian, he was a historian of science, but also a famous scientist himself, famous British scientist Joseph Needham, who led the International Scientific Commission, which had been put forth by the World Peace Council at the time to go to China and North Korea and investigate the charges. This was a very famous investigation, not least because Needham was one of the most foremost scientists of his day, very well respected, a member of a fellow of the Royal Society, had all the documentation that you would want about his expertise, along with scientists from Sweden and Italy and France and other countries, and including also one from the Soviet Union, went to China and North Korea in the summer of 1952, and they looked at all the evidence that had been gathered thus far. They asked questions of the scientists. They retested the materials that had been gathered thus far to see if they really carried the pathogens. They interviewed dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of people, eyewitnesses, mostly villagers, many of them illiterate, who had witnessed or been these biological weapons attacks or been, had been, terrorized by them, and they concluded that the American imperialists had in fact used biological weapons, and they published a 60-page report on it, supplemented by about 650 pages of documentary evidence. And this report, which is also almost always referenced in the histories about this subject in the West, I began to look for this report and I couldn't find it either. I couldn't believe it. Well, where's the report? Let me see with my own eyes what's in the report. I couldn't see it. I finally did in those days you could put out a search. I think it was via Google or something. Can't remember now anymore. Or maybe was it Amazon maybe? Saying, I'm looking for this book if anyone has it. And anyway, a couple of years went by. Finally, I got a notice. There's a book for sale. So I bought it. It was a little expensive, but I couldn't pass it up. And then I had it digitized and I put it on the internet and people can read it now, when before it hadn't been seen in, again, 70 years. And copies of that book were destroyed as well. So just trying to reestablish some of the documentary evidence from that period is what I've been working on. And then, of course, analyzing that evidence myself. And so we've been able to, and still new things come to light. Yes, I don't know if it was earlier another time or just now, an example of how everything can change when you learn something that was suppressed. On the confessions of the flyers, only one flyer was actually put on any sort of trial. He was a Colonel Frank Schwabel. He was with the Marine Corps, and he was one of only 2 Marine Corps officials who had made confessions. He was also the second highest ranking prisoner from the U.S. during the entire Korean War. And the Air Force didn't want to try anybody, and they were warnings from within the government, let's not actually investigate. Don't push this too far. We don't want real details to come out. Just propaganda, get it? Propaganda, not actual investigations. But the Marine Corps, they were steaming over this. And so they put him on they didn't call it a trial, they called it an inquiry, but it was essentially a military trial. And it was big, and it was covered by the mainstream press. And what came. I had long wanted to look at that trial to see what was in it, and thanks to today, we have websites such as newspapers.com. It's not a plug. I'm just telling you that's where I got my information. But it was very helpful because I was able to go back and see what was being reported during the trial. And what I saw blew my mind. Before it was put in my mind, it was a question of were the flyers who had made detailed confessions of use of biological warfare, were they dupes? Were they saying what they really knew, or were they brainwashed? The American version is they were brainwashed and tortured. The other version is no, they were saying the absolute truth. And so the question was, well, what were they told to say? What would happen? What were they told if they were captured they could say? And it turned out from the Schwabel trial, it came out that they were told that they could say everything, that they could testify to anything. Not enlisted men were only supposed to give name, rank, and serial number. You've probably heard this in movies and popular, whatever. There's something in the military called the Code of Conflict. The Code of Conduct, which people are taught, which is you only give name, rank, and serial number, perhaps date of birth, and if you're captured by the enemy. But what came out in this trial, there was testimony both on the stand and then an admission finally in the government in its findings on the Schwabel case at the end, which were printed in the New York Times, that in fact these officers and highly trained Air Force personnel were told that if they were captured, they could say whatever they felt they needed to say. They were not to be bound by name, rank, and serial number. Well, this caused a huge scandal within the military about this double standard. And it's kind of an echo of class, by the way, society and structure. All of these flyers were college educated. They were sophisticated people, and they were in the Air Force. They were flying the very technically complex machines, and versus the grunts out there in the field who were going up Pork Chop Hill and being mowed down, being blown up and whatever. But the fact that this, so what that meant was there was no torture. It shouldn't have even been a question. We know, or they knew then. But even in the New York Times in 1954 or so, when this particular trial's finding finally came to an end, there were various findings that were suppressed. They weren't allowed to come out. In the New York Times article, when they published the findings of the inquiry into Colonel Schwabel's, who, by the way, was found kind of not guilty, if you will. That he did the best he could was what they felt at the end, but his career was destroyed. But there were 4 paragraphs or so in it saying, well, we can't release this paragraph because it speaks to differential instructions given to flyers about what they could say. Well, that's all they needed to know anyway. But it didn't matter because there had already been reportage, there had been stories in the mainstream press about the testimony of other people who said, yeah, we were told we could say anything. And later, much later, one of the flyers, a guy by the name of Bud Mahurin, who was a famous World War II ace and wrote a book called Honest John, who was himself had many friends in the CIA and had also himself given a very detailed confession to the Chinese, wrote in his book that, what could you expect? We were told that we could. So we had confusing instructions, he said. Sometimes they told us keep things secret. Other times they told us you can say whatever you want. Well, that was a backhanded way of admitting that, yes, the instructions were, and I believe the reason was that from the Air Force standpoint, they already knew that people were going to talk. They knew even beforehand. They set up, they knew, some of my research, and people can read it, goes into why I think it would take me too far afield now to say why they believed that. But they knew that some people anyway were going to testify to the biological warfare program, and to just let them do it, because they didn't want these people were capital, if you will. A lot of money and time had been invested in the training of these people, and they wanted them back. They wanted them back to use. And also there's like a good old boys club in the ruling class. If you're the son of an admiral, we don't want you to be tortured. We do care about that. So why don't you just say what you know? And don't worry. Well, it's going to come out anyway. Why should you be tortured? Because whether they believe they'd be tortured or not is another question. But and since they do torturing, I think they believe the other side would do torturing. That's what I think.
And they had the capacity to hide it and cover it up, as they've done throughout the last 7 decades. So let it get out there. We can just cover it up in a million.
And that's exactly, Carl's good point, because that's exactly what they did. And in one of my more recent stories, when I was still at medium.com or publishing through medium.com, I discovered that there was, there was a dissatisfaction within the government about how good a job they were doing at covering this up. And so they, in 1954, again, I believe it was, or 53, I don't have it in front of me at the moment. But anyway, right around that time, they tasked the CIA with trying to discredit people, to destroy them. They literally said, quote unquote, people who were spreading the communist tales, or myth, they put the communist myth, germ warfare myth, that the U.S. had used biological warfare. And at the time, one of the main things I did write about it, Hidden Histories, which is my Substack column, was they went after the journalists who had published China Monthly Review. This was a monthly magazine that came out of China. It was English language. It had been published in China since 1919. Its editor, John W. Powell, who I mentioned later, back at my flash ahead to 1980, revealed the links between the U.S. government and the Japanese Unit 731. But back in 1952, he had taken over the editorship of the China Monthly Review from his father, also named John Powell, who had run that magazine and was well respected and had run it for decades. Who was, by the way, captured by the Japanese and tortured himself for being, anti-Japanese. Anyway, John Powell and his wife and another editor of China Monthly Review, when they returned to the United States in 1954-55, were arrested and prosecuted for sedition, for publishing the confessions around germ warfare and other articles about germ warfare. And that trial dragged on for 5 years until it ended in a mistrial, and then another 2 or 3 years before it was finally dismissed under then Attorney General Robert Kennedy. And they were finally free of government persecution that had gone on for almost 10 years against them. Their son, Thomas Powell, has just written an excellent book called The Secret Ugly, which is about his own research into the history of the biological warfare program, and also his memories of what it was like to be a child growing up at that time in the home, with his mom and dad under attack by the U.S. government. So way before Julian Assange and all these kind of things, the U.S. government did go after people, journalists, and they went after them in a really rough way. They brought down the full weight of the government justice system, so-called justice system, upon them to stop. I think that's another reason, by the way, people have been afraid. Since that time, almost no one in the United States has published on this. The only book of any major note to come out until, say, Tom Powell's book was a book by 2 Canadian historians writing in Toronto, although it was published by University of Indiana Press. So, but again, it had to be a university press, and then there was the government apparatus again mobilized itself to try and discredit what these 2 historians had come up with. It's a great book called The U.S. and Biological Warfare by Stephen Endicott and Edward Hagerman, University of Indiana Press, 1998, and still makes the best case for the America's use for biological warfare of any in book form. And they did not know, sad to say, until the very end They were very old and infirm, and when they heard from me about the communications intelligence reports, and they were very thrilled and enthusiastic about that. But at that point, they were not only at the end of their careers, but the end of their lives. So they couldn't do too much about that.
Oh my God, there's so much here. We got to have you on because we're at the tail end. I think we've gone over a few minutes, but if you'd the last question, how is this going on today? Because we talk about this in the 50s, but I'm sure that considering how perfectly fine our ruling elite is with literal genocide, I'm sure that some of these biological weapons, bacterial germ weapons, the tactics are still within the toolbox of imperialism, within the arsenal of imperialist warfare. So how is it being used today? And also plug where people can find your work, which I definitely recommend.
Well, the use of biological weapons today would necessitate really a whole show, and it's something that I have not pursued because my eye has been so much on the past. But what I've learned from the past, helps me inform what I read about in the present. In 1969, Richard Nixon supposedly put an end to the U.S. biological warfare program, although it was later revealed that a sliver of that persisted by the CIA in CIA hands. But then there was something called the Biological Warfare Convention, which supposedly outlawed biological warfare. The problem with it is that there's no enforcement. There's no enforcement mechanism attached to this agreement. So it's quite clear that the United States and possibly other countries have continued in the guise of research into defense against biological warfare, in fact, have been exploring more biological warfare. And I know a lot of people believe that in Ukraine, this kind of thing was going on, or that COVID was somehow part of this. That's another, such a giant subject. I can't wrap it up in a minute. I will only say this. I do not believe that COVID was ever a biological weapon. I believe it was possibly released as a result of gain-of-function experiments. There are good reasons to believe why it was not a biological weapon, based upon my understanding and study of what make for good biological weapons, which is we could go into, but we don't have time. And people can believe me or not. I could always be wrong, but that's the way I see it at the moment. But I do think there is active research going on that we're not aware of. So many secrets, and there's more. People can find my work currently at the blog Hidden Histories at Substack.com. If you search for that, you'll find me. Yeah. And before that, I was at medium.com. And if you search for me there, you'll find a number of articles I've written that haven't yet migrated over to the Substack platform that directly address, including the copy of the ISC report that I mentioned, the Needham report, can be found there. Yes, that's it.
I am putting both of those in the chat. Jeff, we're absolutely going to have you back. There was a few interesting audience questions as well about the U.S. has uses on its own citizenry, and there's so many parts of it to explore. It's been really a treat to have you on. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you to your listeners.
Thank you. See ya. Have a good day.
Okay.
Well, that was Jeff Kaye with an insane topic that I think we don't talk about enough: the proclivity of our ruling elite to use biological warfare to obtain its ends and keep it as a central arsenal in its war against socialist and anti-imperialist states. And this is why I find it personally outrageous when many folks on the U.S. left, calling themselves Marxists or socialists or whatever, have so easily condemned socialist states because they don't live up to some perfect idea of what socialism ought to be like, when we're dealing with countries that have had to fight back against sanctions, against bombing campaigns. I mean, in Korea, 1/5 of the population basically died. The pilots were going back to the generals and asking them, what else do we bomb? Every single building that's more than 2 stories has been bombed. What do we do? So how do you construct socialism under such intense hybrid warfare, which now, as we've been exploring with Jeff, includes things like biological weapons. This was something that I did a little bit of research in with the African swine fever in Cuba that affected Cuba quite a lot during the early 70s. I remember my parents telling me a lot about that. But again, as was the case with Korea and China, if you look it up in the English media, it's just dismissed as a ridiculous communist myth. For those of us that have lived through it or have had families that have lived through it,